Welcome to All Politics Are Local Extra. This is a weekly show that we do for half an hour to talk to people who have done certain things that I think that are very interesting, especially in the moment that we're living in right now. There are a series of protests. There is a lot going on within this country, and there are people who can better help us understand what's going on and what are some of the things that we should do. So this week, I'm very honored to have Ryan Haygood. He's the president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, and we very much appreciate having him here. He's been a friend of the program. He's been on All Politics Are Local before, and we're happy to have you on All Politics Are Local Extra.
Thanks for having me again, Jonathan. It's good to see you.
It's good seeing you too. Now there are a series of things that are going on inside of this country. There are protests against police brutality. There are massive demonstrations that are even going around the world. What does this mean? How can you help us explain this particular moment that we're in right now?
Yeah, Jonathan. So again, thanks for having me on the show. I've been thinking a lot about this this moment. Some folks have described this moment as a different moment. Others have described us as being at the beginning of the next major social movement. For perspective, when Dr. King was assassinated, there were protests in hundreds of cities across the country. When George Floyd was murdered by the police, there were protests in more than 2,000 cities across the country. So I do think we're really at the beginning of a very powerful protest that really challenges the very nature in which Black people exist in this country, the very nature in which we proclaim that Black lives matter, but really, how do you make that matter really in the way that Black folks have had to live, the way that Black folks have endured structural racism from the time we arrived on the shores of this country? And so what I find especially powerful, especially empowering about this particular moment is that these protests are being led by young people across the country. And as you know, as students of history know, all major social movements, all major struggles for racial justice, all major struggles for freedom, for liberation, for Black people have been led by young people. And that's true, especially now. So as I think about this particular moment, if we really want to make it different, if we really want to make it all that it can be, we have to have conversations that we have not been willing to have. We have to do things we've not been willing to do outside of this moment. And I think the focus, Jonathan, really has to be, how do we begin to have real conversations around repairing the harm that structural racism has visited on Black people?
Now, what do you mean by that? And how, because you've spoken about these things before. You've had your own campaign in terms of the 94%.
Sure.
What is it? What are the conversations that you think that we need to have right now that we are not yet having?
Yeah. So I think the conversations we've not been willing to have, and by we, I mean the broader we, have really been about how do you get to the root of the structural racism, the root of the challenges we see, the root of the police-involved killings across the country, the root of the staggering racial wealth gaps across this country. Last time when we spoke, Jonathan, we talked about the racial wealth gap in New Jersey. New Jersey is a state where the median net wealth for white families is $352,000, the highest in America. But by a really stark, staggering, shameful contrast, the median net wealth for Black families in New Jersey is $6,100.
Wow.
Well, right. So real conversations around repairing harm are, what do you do with that racial wealth gap? And as we know, that racial wealth gap, New Jersey's racial wealth gap, was conceived of, it was birthed in slavery in this state. It was birthed there. It was reinforced by centuries of policies and practices, Black codes, restrictive covenants, redlining.
And these are things that happened in New Jersey specifically. We're not talking about Alabama. We're not talking about Georgia. We're talking about New Jersey specifically. And you were talking about redlining and Black codes. What are those for people who might not know?
Yeah, so for example, we just celebrated Juneteenth on Friday, right? And folks know what Juneteenth is. That's the day on which General Gordon Granger rode into Galveston, Texas, and told 250,000 enslaved Africans that they were free. but they had actually been freed 2 years earlier by the Emancipation Proclamation. New Jersey rejected the Emancipation Proclamation, so that if it were up to New Jersey's history, we wouldn't have any cause to celebrate Juneteenth. New Jersey is a state where slavery took root very, very deeply. It's also a state that gave hundreds of acres to colonists who came to the state and then required Black people to work on that land for free. So to your point, Jonathan, when folks think about slavery, they think about it largely in the context of Southern states. But New Jersey is a place where slavery took root very deeply. And many of the racial disparities we see today in 2020, the racial wealth gap, the highest Black to white adult and youth incarceration disparity rate, the staggering racial disparities in segregation, in healthcare, in every direction, those are deeply rooted in slavery. And so part of why you see our cities having such high concentrations of poverty is because our cities were designed that way through practices like redlining, which is where banks literally took a red marker and drew lines or circles around the city and didn't offer mortgages there. And if they did, they offered them at very high rates. And so part of why we have these racial disparities in the present, part of why we continue to see police killings of unarmed Black people, is because we're continuing to fight to make real the idea that Black lives matter, and we're doing so in face of policies designed to undermine that undeniable truth. And what we're seeing now is young folks and other folks joining to say, we're going to make Black lives matter really by doing a number of things, reimagining what public safety looks like. What are some alternatives to policing? What are some alternatives the way that we do incarceration? And how do we make investments in those other strategies that actually empower our communities, not make deep withdrawals from our communities?
Now, there are some issues that you've had at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, and you've consistently talked about the 94%. You said that Black voters have voted for the current Democratic governor 94%. And one of the most basic police reforms that's being pushed by Newark, is actually in the New Jersey Supreme Court right now, is the CCRB, the Civilian Complaint Review Board, and it's a strong one that Newark developed to hold police accountable, and it's being resisted very heavily by the police union.
Yep.
Now, I heard that the Attorney General that we have right now could approve of this board, and it's not even a Supreme Court issue. He could just sign it, and say, hey, it's good. There's no need to even contest it. What do you have to think? Like, how does that play into this moment where there are protests? We have already voted. We voted 94%, but we have an Attorney General who looks at something that is very much needed. All over the country, people are protesting right now, and he's refusing to do anything. How does that make sense given what you're saying about the 94%?
Yeah. I think the power of the CCRB was that it was created on the strength of advocacy of people in Newark for some real police oversight, some real police accountability, going back 52 years to the Newark Rebellion. And so folks know that Newark had an uprising in 1967. One of the chief calls that came out of that was that there needed to be some real oversight, some real police accountability. And for 50 years, Newark residents advocated for a CCRB. It passed the city council, then it was quickly challenged by the Fraternal Order of Police, and it's now before the Supreme Court, to your point, Jonathan. But what I think the CCRB tells us is that we are especially powerful when we organize ourselves up from the ground up in our community. Very often people think about Washington, D.C. and the national moment. And to be sure, this is one of the most difficult national moments in a generation. And so, yes, we need some change at the federal level, but we've also known, history taught us very clearly that when people organize themselves in their communities, Selma, Alabama, Newark, New Jersey, we are powerful there. And part of our power is in the power of our vote.
But how does that play into, we voted for our current governor by 94%. The governor knows how important the CCRB is to us, that we've been fighting for it for 50 years. Yeah. His attorney general can sign something, and it's good.
Yep.
Like, what should our response be?
Yeah. So I think the first part is exercising the vote. But to your point, Jonathan, the second piece of it, is holding elected officials accountable. And the reason that that when you and I spoke about Governor Murphy's 94%, this was a conversation about that second piece. So you voted. Look, Black people in New Jersey cast their ballots at a rate of 94%. So 94% of Black people who voted in the last gubernatorial election pulled the lever for Governor Murphy. What was striking was that he only got 47% of the white vote.
Wow.
So if it's up to white voters, we may not have Governor Murphy as the governor. We know for sure that we have him as governor in large part because of the near unanimous support for him. And so the question that we discussed last time was, so given that near unanimous support, 94%, what is Governor Murphy doing specifically to ensure that Black Lives Matter really in New Jersey? And I will say that we've been able to do a good number of things with him around the $15 minimum wage. We passed online voter registration, automatic voter registration. We passed a independent prosecutor bill, which is being tested right now following the Maurice Gordon killing on the Parkway. We passed a bill that restored the right to vote to 84,000 people on probation and parole. We ended prison-based gerrymandering. All of those things came because we held him accountable. But to your point, Jonathan, there's a lot of work to be done, particularly around repairing the harm that Black folks continue to face that's rooted in slavery in New Jersey. So I want to lift up, one thing that we've been championing. You and I have talked a lot about this. There was a bill introduced last year. It was introduced in November to coincide with the 400th anniversary of Black folks' arrival in Jamestown, Virginia. It's a bill that creates a reparative justice task force or a reparations task force. It will do two things. One, it will require New Jersey to take responsibility for its role in American slavery. The second piece is, in light of how slavery happened in New Jersey, it'll require the task force to create a number of policy proposals and make deep investments in communities most impacted by that enduring legacy. I think unless and until we address the root causes of what we're seeing play out on our television screens in our communities, until we get to the root cause of the enduring legacy of slavery, we won't make progress, and we'll be having these conversations, defensive conversations, from this point forward. So part of what this moment requires, I think, is that we begin to repair the harm of structural racism, beginning with passing this bill. Last thing I'll say on this point, Jonathan, is no state in the country has ever passed a bill like this. No state. There was a federal bill introduced by John Conyers 35 years ago. It had a hearing at the end of 2019. It hasn't moved. And part of the reason is because we have been unwilling, and here I mean we broadly, we have been unwilling to have finally a serious conversation about the root of the challenge we continue to live with and how to address them, and what are the state's responsibilities for taking ownership over this enduring legacy of slavery.
Since I've known you, you've been forward thinking on these issues. You have looked from the 94% for when you were looking at prison reform. You are actually always looking for what is the root cause and how can we deal with things that get at that root cause. Even in your work in the Institute for Social Justice, New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, what in your past led you to this point? Like, how did you start to become forward thinking? How did you start to think about root causes? Yeah. What are some of the things in your biography that led you to the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice and the type of thinking that you're doing anyway? Yeah,
I think that's a great question, Jonathan. I would love to ask you that as well. For me, briefly, I'm from Denver, Colorado. I was raised there by my mom. My mom raised me by herself, and I went to a high school. It was in the then historically Black part of Denver, and I say the then because the neighborhood's complexion has changed quite a bit. But it was at Manual High School that I had a social studies teacher, Mr. Pettigen, who used to show us these videos, these black and white videos called Eyes on the Prize.
Oh.
Right? You know this one, right? And these videos, Jonathan, they capture these heroes whose names we mostly wouldn't come to know, but who literally put themselves in harm's way to force this country to live up to its high ideals and away from its low practices. And that class taught me that democracy for Black people has always been contested. You see this after Reconstruction. There was an expansion of democracy. You see at the end of Reconstruction, democracy scaled way back. And so part of what I've learned is that democracy for us is a fight. It's a verb. It requires you to put yourself in harm's way. So, you can't, for example, have a Barack Obama for 2 terms without then having the current president. That's just a theme, that it's expansion always followed by efforts to scale back all of the progress. And so, it's funny.
And you're saying you learned this in high school through watching Eyes on the Prize.
Eyes on the Prize. And I would tell you, look, the class was, it was right after lunch. There wasn't air conditioning at that time. There were kids who slept. I mean, literally put head down on the desk, went to sleep. But I was transformed by this, because it was here that I saw the role in which Black people were integral to the effort to make this country be what it said it was or wanted to be. And I realized the central role that Black people play in making this country better, the way in which the struggle for freedom and liberation is one that we have advanced even now. There's this, I shared with you, there's this cover of the New Yorker magazine. If you've not seen it, it's powerful. There's outline of George Floyd. At the bottom, it starts with our journey over the Atlantic Ocean. In the middle is Rodney King. Mm-hmm. And this is when I was in high school. This is when I first saw on a camcorder video the way in which Rodney King took 56 or 59 blows at the hands of 4 white officers. And we are now, almost 30 years later, having a very similar conversation about harm reduction.
I remember first seeing the Rodney King video and thinking, wow, they finally caught them on video. They'll definitely be convicted. I remember thinking that.
Yeah, and imagine, so like if you imagine it, that's March 3rd, 1991. We're thinking there's video, but what emerged from that video, I remember folks saying, well, look, he's trying to get up. He should just lie there, right? He's resisting. And you remember those 4 white officers were acquitted. It took federal civil rights charges to finally convict 2 of them. And I lift that up because I think what we've been learning about our experience in this country going back 400 years is we've always been fighting to show the way in which Black lives matter, right? That's an undeniable truth to us, but it's been tested everywhere, including across this country right now. And so I want for us to think about, even though we're in a crisis moment, fighting for our lives, urging that police officers stop killing us, thinking about different strategies, alternatives to policing, making investments in strategies that actually increase public safety, that don't involve policing. Even as we do that, I would just love for folks to be thinking about this question, right? Which is, what does it mean for Black folks to win? What is an affirmative strategy for victory for us? And I don't think we can get there until we push for reparations, right? The repair from the harm that has been visited upon Black folks because of the structure, the cracks in our structure, the cracks in our foundation. And so part of the charge has to be to repair that foundation by making deep investments, policy investments, and other investments in communities that have been separated from the very things that we have deserved from the time that we got to this country.
And so when you're looking at the conversation about reparations, you really are going to look at these root causes.
Absolutely.
You talked about high school, you talked about Eyes on the Prize. What are some of those other things that brought you from high school in Denver to doing really good work in New Jersey and in Newark?
Yeah, so in the Eyes on the Prize video, I learned about Thurgood Marshall. And I was blown away at the way in which Thurgood, who, folks obviously know, goes on to found the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and then he becomes the first Black Supreme Court justice. And I was transformed by the way in which he would use his mind to destroy straight up racists. Like his brilliance, his legal acumen, his fierce love for Black people, his advocacy, his preparation. He would destroy in court and outside of court straight up racists on behalf of Black folks. And in Denver, Colorado, in high school, watching him, I was like, you know, I want to do that. I want to do that with my life. And so in law school, I applied for an internship with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. That summer, I lived in the Newark YMCA, worked at the Legal Defense Fund, and I learned about a fellowship at that time after law school, which was a 2-year fellowship with a law firm, a 2-year fellowship with LDF. And praise God, I got that fellowship. And I was with LDF for more than 10 years before I came to the Institute for Social Justice.
And what is LDF?
LDF is the NAACP
Legal Defense Fund. Okay.
Founded by Thurgood Marshall. And so at LDF, I did national level civil rights litigation for, as I mentioned, more than 10 years. But I really began to see the power when people advocated in an organized way from the ground up. And so I was excited to come to New Jersey. You know, I've lived in Newark with my wife, who was the principal of Avon Avenue School. We've lived here for more than 19 years. And I was excited to come back to Newark and really think about how do you work with our communities to advance really forward-thinking, powerful systems change strategies from the ground up in our community. And I'm really proud of the work that the organization that I'm a part of does. You know, we're an organization of about 20 or so people, majority Black women, lawyers, PhDs, community organizers. And our theory of change really is that we want to effectuate systemic racial justice advocacy from the ground up in our communities in a way that opens up opportunities for people of color across New Jersey, with a specific focus on racial justice and Black people in particular.
And it's interesting because it seems like what you're doing is because you love the law, mm-hmm. and you believe that the law can be used to make change.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you're saying that massive grassroots efforts
mm-hmm.
have to be done in conjunction with that.
Mm-hmm.
Voting has to be done in conjunction with that. It seems like is that what you're talking about, like an all-in strategy?
Absolutely. I think, you know, you can't, there's no way that you can advance any meaningful change without centering communities most impacted by the issues in the effort. And this is true of any litigation. This is true of any public policy or legislative strategy. You have to center those who've already been fighting for this issue, whatever the issue is, in the middle of that advocacy effort. And so, you know, you and I have talked a bunch about this. I give you one quick example around youth incarceration in New Jersey. You know, New Jersey is a state where a Black child is 21 times more likely to be in prison than a white child. 21 times, the highest racial disparity in the country, even though Black and white kids commit most offenses at about the same rate. And New Jersey is also a state under Governor Murphy's administration that spends $300,000 to incarcerate each kid each year. So Jonathan, imagine if you were to invest $300,000 in the life of your students at science. What could you do in their lives?
Hold on. Wait, back up.
Yep.
Did you say that we invest $300,000 in one child who's incarcerated?
Every year.
Wait, stop. Let's
no.
You're saying $300,000 for one child incarcerated in juvenile justice. That's the actual price tag you're telling me.
The number. And it's actually grown. You know, I mean, if it was really, really, really gangster, is that under Chris Christie, it was $250. Under Governor Murphy, it jumped up to $300,000. Here's the thing, though. The youth incarceration population is falling. The cost of incarcerating each kid is rising. Why?
Why?
Because Governor Murphy is deploying more people to the youth prisons, even as the youth prison population is falling. You follow me? And here's
so I think I'm following you, but I don't think I want to. So help us out.
So in the last year, 35 additional employees have been assigned to New Jersey's youth prisons, even as the youth prison population is falling, which is why the cost of incarcerating each kid has risen. And I'll add another, you and I talked about this last time. I love Mos Def, one of my favorite rappers of all time. And Mos Def talks a lot about today's mathematics, right? The numbers. and how the numbers are real. And so in this mathematics song of his, he talks about today's mathematics. So I want to give you this number, another one. So New Jersey is a state of 9 million people, right? 9 million people. Hold that number in your head. 9 million people in New Jersey. There are about 200 kids who are incarcerated in the whole state, and 8 of them are white. 8.
Oh.
Today's mathematics. 8. Now, here's the thing. Like we all know, that number doesn't reflect actual participation in crime on the count of white kids. What it does reflect is that there's a very different policy response by our youth justice system when it relates to white kids.
So it's not like, so a lot of people are going to be like, well, black kids just they did crime, right? But you're like, no, all the numbers say that they commit these things at equal rates. Yep. It's just there's white justice in New Jersey.
Absolutely. And so to the point, this is why the 94% is so important, Jonathan, because when black people make such deep investments in supporting any candidate, Governor Murphy, a mayor, a city council member, a school board member, that candidate has to have a very specific plan to address the challenges black people face. And what happens very often is that elected officials will do very ceremonial things for black people.
Like wear kente cloth, scarves.
And they'll come to, they'll come to an event, they'll do black things, they'll wave the Black Liberation flag, they'll stop by a block party, they'll do a photograph with you, you'll put it on Facebook because you feel like your proximity to power is itself a reflection of progress for black people.
Right.
But I think for us, the next level of power is holding elected officials accountable. So if it's Governor Murphy, and I focus on him because that's the most powerful position in New Jersey. Right. And New Jersey's governorship is actually one of the most powerful governorships in the country. Lots of power to appoint the attorney general, to appoint county prosecutors, several thousand positions, Supreme Court. I mean, it's a powerful position. But what we have not seen from Governor Murphy yet is a plan that is specific to realizing Black Lives Mattering actually. So what I would love for your folks who follow you to do is the next time you see one of your state legislative representatives or the governor himself or one of his people, 2 questions, right? 3 quick questions. 1, racial wealth gap for black people. Median net worth, $6,100. Governor Murphy, it's $352,000 for white people, highest in America. What is your specific plan to close the racial wealth gap? Number 2, black to white youth incarceration disparity rate. New Jersey has the worst. Black kid, 21 times more likely to be in prison than a white kid. What are you doing? Not building new prisons.
Right.
What are you doing? $300,000 specific investment to incarcerate black kids. What's up with that? 3rd point, do you support reparations for black people? There's a bill that was introduced, a reparative justice task force bill introduced in last November, again this year in January. You haven't heard about that bill because it hasn't moved. But why? See, if we begin to ask those very pointed questions of everyone who represents us, including the governor, I think we'll start to see how powerful we can be in holding elected officials accountable. That's particularly important now as we have this incredible power in protests, but we've got to move the protest to change policies. We have to move the protest to deep investments in black communities. We have to move the protest to things that empower our communities. Look, the truth is, no matter the politician, or even those who sound in change, if we get honest, politicians are generally keepers of the status quo. That's just how they are. They get in office, even as change agents, and they very often get comfortable in the seat. And before you know it, they've been there for decades. So it's incumbent upon us to be disruptors of the status quo. So when we organize and push, those elected officials begin to move. But on their own, they're going to keep the status quo because that's just generally their orientation. That's their constitution. They got elected a certain way, and they want to keep it. So Governor Murphy, to concretize this conversation, he's up for re-election next year. It's a totally fair question to ask. When you came into office, the racial wealth gap was here. Today, it's actually worsened. When you came into office, the state was spending $250,000 to incarcerate each kid. Under your leadership, it's grown to $300,000. What is your specific plan, specific to Black people plan to address these racial disparities connected to slavery? It's not enough on a tweet to say Black Lives Matter. That's ceremony. How do you make Black Lives Matter real in the context of Black people confronting some of the worst racial disparities in the country? And that is not a conversation elected officials are going to lead. That's a conversation we have to champion and ensure gets heard, and that it actually is empowered through policy change.
Thank you so much. We are ending the half hour, and thank you so much for giving us your time. We appreciate you speaking and coming out here, and I hope that people learn something from this interaction. We have to definitely hear a lot more from you, and thank you again.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate you.
Appreciate you back.